Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I've Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. And it is time for another edition of Female First, which means we are once again joined by the wonderful, the magnificent, the well-traveled Yves. Welcome, Yves.
Thank you. What an introduction.
Thank you. I do get in my head about them, but that's when it gets worse. So you just got to go with the flow, you know? Don't overthink things.
Yeah.
It feels like lifetime since we've seen you. I was thinking about this today. So much has happened. We were catching up before. So much has happened in all of our lives since the last time we recorded. How are you, Yves?
I'm doing good today. You know, I am like enjoying the crispy, cool weather. I was outside with shorts and a t-shirt on earlier, and usually I'm not that kind of person. So I'm like, am I becoming a fall person? Because I usually think of myself as a spring and summer person. Mm-hmm. But pretty soon I'll be headed into climates that are a lot colder than the one that I'm used to in the South. I'll probably run into some snow. So I'm going to see if I really am a fall girly pretty soon. Because this fall is a fall. This is fall light, right? You know, and that we get in Atlanta. So once I go farther north and hit fall full on, then I'll see if I can make that determination for sure. But yeah, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling well rested and also excited at the same time, which I feel like is a good space to be in. Yeah. What about y'all?
I feel better today. There's been a lot of stress. I think everybody's just a lot of stress right now. And we have been really busy. If the listeners of the show know, we've had a lot of surprise things happen in the past few weeks. But I woke up early today. And you know when your life is just in chaos and things just build up. I took out my trash. I broke down the boxes. I just did a bunch of stuff that I have not had time to do, or if I had the time, I did not have the energy to do. So I also got to go outside. That was nice. Not always.
So you're getting rid of things.
Yeah. It was really nice. I took a shower last night, Samantha says. Oh my gosh. I'm living the dream. That's how stressed I've been though, is that if I can check off these things, I feel a lot better.
That's nice.
I think I'm with you with the trying. I love fall. We just don't get a lot of it. I think we've talked about this enough that I'm trying to get into the spirit of it, and I think it's working. We've talked about soup on our show, Yves, because I love soup, and last week was a great week of weather for soup. So I was very excited for a split second. I was like, yeah, let me get some of that. Halloween is coming up.
Don't really have much. How could I not mention that? Sorry.
Yeah, hello. Not much planned. Going to see some friends, and hopefully I'm not super awkward. That's the plan. We'll see. I'll take my anti-anxiety meds just in case. So I'm feeling prepared at the very, very least. I think I don't know what this year has been about except for anxiety plus planning. And that's been the entirety of, I don't know why this year it's become that, but every time I do this, some things have happened, Anney gets jury duty. But then coming out of it and being hey, we made it, feels really relieving. So I don't know exactly what looks like in the future, but I'm very optimistic as well, which is odd for me. That is not usually my go-to.
Yeah.
But hey, that's a good place to be today.
It is. I love that for you, Samantha.
Thank you. We're recording this, so we've got this on record.
Yeah, accountability.
Yes. Well, I am so excited to talk about the person you brought today, Yves. This has got a crossover from someone else we've talked about. It's got a lot of different firsts going on. It's just such a great story. Can you tell us who we are discussing today?
Yes. So we are talking about Willa Brown, who was the first Black woman to have a commercial pilot's license from the U.S. And she advocated for Black pilots to be accepted into the aviation community. So I think in the past, we've talked a little bit about aviatrixes. I remember saying that word.
Yes.
Because that's the word they used for female pilots I won't be saying that word today, but if you read some of the articles about her and some of the texts that are about her biography, you'll see that they use the terminology aviatrix. But it's a pretty cool thing to do, to fly as a woman in the early 1900s. And Willa Brown was a person who did that, whose biography and legacy have been uncovered and uplifted. But, she's been in Hall of Fames, which we'll get to a little bit more at the end of her story. But it's definitely worth talking about more because she was kind of integral in bringing more Black people into aviation and like being an actual force for that. So she did that as virtue of being a pilot herself, but she also advocated for that. Like she spoke up for other people doing it, other Black people getting invested in it, other women becoming invested in aviation.
Yeah, she did so much. And that's something we've talked about before on this show of how inspirational it is to see people who care to teach the next generation or bring in more people. And she was definitely living that, embodied that. So shall we get into her story?
Yeah, we'll start when she was born, which was on January 22nd, 1906 in Glasgow, Kentucky. And her parents were Hallie Mae Carpenter and Eric Brown. And in 1915, she and her family moved from their farm in Kentucky to Indianapolis, Indiana. She had several siblings, several brothers, and their family was looking for relief from Jim Crow in Kentucky. And they were also looking for more opportunities like so many Black people were seeking at the time. But Indianapolis still was a racist place. Like, it's not like they were leaving out of, out of the frying pan and into some sort of heaven. They went to another place where they still had more difficulties. So then they moved to Terre Haute in Indiana, but same thing there. They still face difficulties and discrimination. And in Indiana, she went to Wiley High School, which was a desegregated school there in South Terre Haute. And there weren't many Black people there. So I think I saw that there were like less than 15 Black people who went to that school. And Willa also worked part-time as a domestic worker while in school. So we've seen this often for people who were going through their studies, but they still had stuff that they had to do at home. They still had to take care of their families. They were responsible in some way for the economic stability of the family. And so that was probably the case for Willa. But she graduated high school in 1923. And she went to Indiana State Normal School, which is now Indiana State University. She majored in business and she minored in French. And I'm not so sure what drove her to major and minor in those things. I mean, I would love to know a little bit more about what drove her to be interested in business and French, but I'm not quite sure about that. But it is known that she also joined the Black sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha. And before she graduated, she got a teaching job at the Roosevelt Annex in Gary, Indiana. She taught typewriting and stenography when she was there, and she also sponsored the writing club. And she was faculty advisor for the school's newspaper. So at the beginning of the episode, we talked a little bit about how she advocated for other people once she gets into her aviation career. But I just wanted to stop to think about how some of her early interest in teaching and in developing her own writing and her own communication skills and other people's communication skills probably would have been a great foundation for that kind of public relations, kind of promotional work that she did later when it comes to piloting. So I imagine at this point, she has clearly, if she's teaching it, a great foundation in communications and writing and knowing how to speak to people and knowing how to develop her voice, how to use it in a persuasive manner and things like that. So when she was working in Gary, she met Wilbur J. Hardaway, who was a Black Republican alderman who represented the 5th Ward on the city council. He was also a member of the local chapter of the NAACP. And he graduated from the Tuskegee Institute and was one of the first Black firefighters in Gary. He also, I'm not so sure about much of the conversations that they had in their relationship, but he also probably had to do with the development of her consciousness around Blackness, around politicism, around investment in your community. It seems like he might have had some sort of role in her life in helping encourage the development of those things in her, or the way that they spoke to each other and worked together was part of that development. They got married on November 24th, 1929, and they divorced in 1931. And she later explained that she wasn't cut out to be a housewife. And once we start going through her story a little bit more, it feels like that'll kind of make sense. This was her first time getting married. It won't be her last time getting married in her life. And also she was very, very invested in flying and in developing her career in aviation. So she got her degree from Indiana State in 1931. And in 1932, she moved to Chicago. So at the time, Chicago was largely segregated, with most of the Black folks living on the South Side. But I'm sure y'all have talked about the history of Chicago during this time. Like, it was very vibrant. It was full of lots of Black culture, social movements and arts. And there was a lot of movement around Black people developing themselves professionally and developing their social consciousnesses in Chicago. So when she was in Chicago, Willa worked as a secretary to the director of the Chicago Relief Administration. She also worked as a social services worker for the Cook County Bureau of Public Welfare. She worked as a clerk for the U.S. Department of Immigration and Naturalization, and she worked for the U.S. Post Office. And she was at some point a secretary for the scholar Horace Cayton. She was also the first Black person to work at the Social Security Board's Chicago office. So moving on to where she became interested in aviation. She, like many other Black women at the time, was very inspired by Bessie Coleman. So I think a lot of people are probably familiar with Bessie Coleman, another person who has a huge legacy, a Black woman who has a huge legacy in aviation in the United States and overseas, because she was like, when I think about Bessie Coleman, I think about, she was like one of those foundational people in Black History Month for me. Like when I was in kindergarten, she was one of the people who was on the little contour drawings that they would do. And we would have to color them in and they would put them up on the wall. Bessie Coleman was one of those people, next to George Washington Carver and Garrett Morgan. And so I think about that when I think about Bessie Coleman and how foundational of a legacy she is. So it's nice to see her show up in Willa Brown's legacy, because she too was a pioneer. And it's nice to see how that lineage and line kind of continued, and Willa was able to be inspired by Bessie and actually wrap that history into the work that she was doing herself. So Bessie Coleman was the first Black woman and Native American to have a pilot's license, and Bessie got her license in 1921 in France. So Willa, in 1934, she worked at a Walgreens in Chicago, and she met a Black pilot named John C. Robinson. And he was also an important person in her becoming inspired to get into aviation. John Robinson convinced her to take flying lessons, and Chicago was like a hub for Black pilots and aviation in the country. So Willa Brown was in a good place. So this is where she starts to fall into, I met the right people and I have interest and I'm in the right place to actually see this interest go somewhere. And all the sources and the different sources that I've read about Willa Brown, they all kind of mention his intro, his encouragement of her to get into aviation, and also her inspiration by Bessie Coleman. But there has to be so much more of a story here, because, and I don't know it, because I'm not a scholar in Willa Brown's life, and the sources that I've read haven't gone super, super deep into that. And I'm not sure if it's fully known, because to be a Black woman, to be Black, to be a woman at the time, to want to get into aviation, there has to be some sort of strong impetus, even if it's not the picture perfect movie version of like, I had this ta-da, aha moment of, I was like, oh, I can, I can do this thing that nobody else is really doing, or not many people at all are doing in this way. And I feel confident enough to go into it. Not so sure about that. Also not sure how her parents may have raised her, or what it was in her childhood that would have given her the gumption, the, strength, the fortitude, and the will to be able to go into this field. And also, I mean, I would like to, we may have talked about this last time we talked about pilots, but I would like to learn how to fly planes, but it's the thing I know I'm not going to do. But it is an apocalyptic skill that I would like to have, because I feel like it would be very useful. But it seems so scary. So like, to want to do something that like is so like, to me, fearless in a way, and requires a lot of knowledge to learn how to do at this time, when you're facing so many direct challenges, because there were direct challenges for her as a Black woman, then that seems like that takes a lot of will for sure. So wish I knew more about that. I do not, but I think there's a little bit of room to bring our imaginations and, educated guesses into play here. So John Robinson introduced her to Cornelius Coffey. And John and Cornelius taught at the Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical School, which they had attended before and fought to bring more Black students to. So as part of them trying to get enrolled into this school, they were like, hey, no Black students are here, but I can come here. And basically they later got the approval. They were like, okay, if you can bring 25, I think it was, more Black students into this school, then you can start a separate Black. Y'all can't be together with the white folks, but y'all can start your own separate Black situation where you're teaching the Black students how to fly. So John and Cornelius taught the first all-Black class at the school in 1932. So Willa Brown was in good company, in good pioneering company. Willa started taking lessons at the segregated Harlem Airport, which was in Oak Lawn, Illinois. And she did have some setbacks, though. So off to a good start, lots of momentum. But in 1934, she was in a car accident that broke a lot of her bones. And after recovering from her injuries, she started flying lessons again. And she took classes at the Curtiss-Wright School, and she took them with Cornelius Coffey. So in 1935, she got a master's mechanics certificate and her student pilot's license. Student, because she'll get other pilot's license later, but this is her student pilot's license. And she joined the Challenger Air Pilots Association, which was a Black flying club in Chicago. Willa wanted more Black women to be pilots. So she tried to get more publicity. In 1936, she went to the Chicago Defender's newsroom, a Black newspaper, to cover an air show that would be sponsored by the Challenger Air Pilots Association. And so there is a recounting of this incident. Enoch Waters, who was the paper's editor, covered the show and even took a ride in Willa's plane. And they did figure eights and flipovers. And Enoch said that he wasn't convinced of her competence until they landed smoothly. So he had to see it until he believed it, I guess. I mean, I'm like, you did figure eights and flipovers and you weren't convinced then? I don't know. He said it was a little scary, but that went well. And Black newspapers in general did kind of follow Willa Brown and cover her accomplishments when she got new licenses and covered some of the events that Black pilots were participating in. So she helped in being forward and going to people and trying to get the coverage to make sure that what they were doing, people knew about it. Because there were, of course, not only detractors, but people who were outwardly hateful about Black pilots and their ability, literally their competence. Like, I think Enoch was kind of joking, but literally people were questioning their competence. I mean, that was probably a pretty tongue-in-cheek, because there were a lot of comments about how Black people can't do that. Like, they don't have the sound judgment. They don't have the capability mentally. You know, I'm sure sometimes they probably tried to back that up with forms of scientific racism. They don't have the actual capability of flying planes. They can't do it. So what are you talking about? Especially Black women. So, you know, as we know today, and all the disinformation and misinformation that's spread online, the intentional effort to put out the truth was an important part of combating the disinformation that was happening from the people who just didn't want Black people to exist at all in any way, shape, and form anyway, and definitely not pilot planes. So Willa and other Black female pilots formed the Chicago Girls Flight Club. And I think when I was looking stuff up, there was also, so this was for the Black women, there was another group called the Chicago Girls Fly Club or something like that. That was very close in name, which had to have been purposeful. Like, you know, if people were hearing about this thing, they accidentally, you know, they could have confused one for the other, which probably worked out well for them, but that is just me speculating. But the names are very close. So Willa, John, Cornelius, and other Black pilots also formed the National Negro Airmen Association of America in 1937. The organization later was renamed the National Airmen Association of America. And Cornelius, in 1937, opened the Coffee School of Aeronautics. Around the same time, so Willa had to have been going to school up until this point. She got her master's degree in business administration from Northwestern University in 1937. So this track that she started on before she got into aviation, she was still on. She was still interested in business administration. I'm not it definitely came in handy in the work that she was doing. I'm not sure why she continued to go on this path, but her background knowledge in business administration clearly was helpful for the work that she was doing and helping run the coffee school, because she helped Cornelius run the coffee school, and helping how she kind of had the wherewithal to market the accomplishments that they were making. Clearly, it was a good base for her to become the person that she became in aviation. And speaking of, in April 1938, she got her solo pilot's license. And then in June, she got her private pilot's license. And that license allowed her to fly non-paying passengers in her plane. So I'm curious, just jog my memory for y'all. Are y'all okay with flying on the smaller planes or planes at all?
I am. I've been on 2 really small planes, and that it is a little scarier because it's moving all around, and I can only imagine at this time different technology. So I don't know how cool I would have been with it back then. Generally, yes. Recently, because we keep hearing news about how the planes are falling apart, I've gotten a little more nervous, but generally, yes.
Okay.
I don't have many experiences with smaller planes, but in general, it's according to what medication I'm on at that point in time. A, B, how big the flight is and how rough the flight is. Because I do get motion sickness pretty badly. So all of that kind of encompasses that. And then after years of seeing all the reports of all the planes falling apart, that I'm like, I'm a little nervous. But not it's not debilitating. But I don't know about small planes. I think I've been on one small plane. I can't remember my reaction other than, oh God, it's small. That's it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I'm just trying to think about what it was like for her back then to fly those smaller planes. She did end up, I think it was by 1940, she ended up buying her own airplane. So she was definitely moving forward pretty quickly. And there was in the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a Black newspaper, they covered her accomplishment of getting her private pilot's license. And she responded to that coverage with a letter to the editor. And she said this: "When I whipped my airplane through the designated spins, spirals, figure eights, verticals, and passed the written test last month to get a private pilot's license, I was overcome with joy to have accomplished my desire. But there also came a deep satisfaction to know that our newspapers and magazines showed such courtesy as to carry articles and pictures concerning this event. So she, in this kind of meta-narrative situation, was expressing her love for knowing that people were actually paying attention and people were doing the work to cover it. She had to take her written and her flight test a couple of times, though, after failing portions of the exam and not getting passing scores on her flights. But on August 1939, she got her limited commercial license. And also, Willa and Cornelius Coffey got married. And I've seen different dates for this, but it looks like it was 1939. And it was that same year that President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Civil Pilot Training Act into law. So this is kind of where we start to see Willa Brown's reach expand beyond their circle in Chicago. So this act authorized the Civil Aviation Authority to train civilian pilots through educational institutions. According to the rules of this act, the program had to include Black folks. So they were like, it's got to have Black folks in it. And another stipulation was that some of the trainees had to be non-college students. And the National Airmen Association of America applied to the Civil Aviation Authority, and it planned on using the Coffey School of Aeronautics for flight training. So from now on, when I bring up the National Airmen's Association, I'm just going to say NAAA because it's kind of a mouthful. And I won't say that too often, so don't worry, y'all. So Willa worked to get the NAAA accepted to the Civil Pilot Training Program. And in 1939, it was accepted as a training provider. Huge deal. So now they, through their school, can train Black pilots. And Time magazine reported on this accomplishment in a September 1939 issue, and this is what they said. One civilian flyer who was highly pleased by CAA's announcement was a cream and coffee-skinned negress of 29. There is a small chance that Willa Beatrice Brown will ever fly for the Army or Navy. Sorry for laughing. But as secretary of the National Airmen's Association and one of the few Negro aviatrixes holding a limited commercial license, she has labored mightily to whip up interest in flying among Negroes and to get them a share in CAA's training program. And so I'm just laughing because they're like, oh, she can do this, but she's definitely not going to do that. She's never going to fly for the Army or Navy. So they had to reel back the complimentary attitude just a little bit. Right. They had to temper that. They were like, calm down, you know?
Right.
You're not going to get all that so soon, not so fast.
It feels like the person who was assigned to write that was like, I don't want to do this, but fine, I'll do it this way.
That's true, Samantha. They probably really did it. They're probably like, oh, I have to write a complimentary passage about a Black woman today. Oh, God.
Damn.
Yeah. So Willa and her colleagues from other colleges and institutions who were involved in the training program formed the Aeronautical Association of Negro Schools. And she became the organization's vice president. And they wanted to address students' concerns like getting college credits for program courses and getting adequate equipment. In 1940, she got her ground instructor rating, which allowed her to teach ground school courses. And as kind of an example of how she was starting to reach beyond and really trying to make her reach massive and the scope of how she was trying to get more Black people into aviation more massive. In 1941, she wrote a letter to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and she said, during the past 3 years, I have devoted full time to aviation, and for the most part, marked progress has been made. I have, however, encountered several difficulties. Several of them I have handled very well, and some have been far too great for me to master. So she's acknowledging some of the difficulties that she went to, some of the discrimination that she was facing in her attempted advocacy for more Black people to get into aviation. And she's writing to the First Lady, so she knows how big of a deal this is, not just because she feels that more Black people should be entitled to and allowed to be in aviation and have the resources and the means to learn how to do so, but also because, like, you know, the country could probably benefit from this too. And from having more people in aviation, especially at this time. So when new rules for federal pilot's licenses were passed in 1941, Willa took tests to get her commercial airman certificate because they were changing the rules, and I think they were going to get rid of the limited commercial license that she had. So she took those tests. However, she failed, and she reverted back to a private pilot's license. When the U.S. entered World War II in 1941, though, the pilot training program, which was civilian, switched to training pilots for serving in the military. So at this point, women couldn't go to training classes, and many of the Black training schools closed. But in 1942, the CAA announced that it was authorized to train Black people as non-combat pilots. And initially, they approved training 150 Black pilots. Half of those would be at Tuskegee, and the other half would be at Coffee School, which is where Willa was. So the Tuskegee Institute and the Coffee School stayed open, and they kept training Black students. And Willa and the Coffee School trained some students who became Tuskegee Airmen. And Willa was gaining popularity for her own flying. She was described as a, quote, woman who swears occasionally, plays cards once a week, likes to sip cocktails at the bar, and simply craves gospel music. So there's a little bit more of her personality showing up beyond her piloting that she did. And besides the advocacy work that she was, a little bit more of her personality showing up so we can know a little bit more about Willa the person. And she also helped establish the first desegregated Civil Air Patrol unit in the country. The Civil Air Patrol supported using civilian resources to aid the war effort. And the first Black unit of the Civil Air Patrol was established in Illinois in February of 1942. And Willa Moore first became the first Black member and first female officer in the Civil Air Patrol on February 25th of that year. And she had different appointments, and she was commissioned as the second lieutenant. And the 111th Flight Squadron of the Illinois Civil Air Patrol began operations in March 1942. Most of those pilots, I think there were 25, they were men and women. And most of those pilots in the unit were from Coffee School. So in 1943, when Willa got her mechanic's license, she became the first American woman to have both a mechanic's and a commercial pilot's license. So Willa's getting more into bringing other people up. So she's got her own accomplishments. Now she's trying to bring more young people into flying. So in 1944, she started a recruiting drive to enroll 5,000 children as members of a junior airmen's group. But soon, she decided that she was going to kind of leave that effort behind. She passed it along to someone else. I believe it was Cornelius who took over after her, but she left. It says she was temporarily retiring from aviation to fight the New Deal's racist policies. So she wanted full integration, not segregated units. So the segregated units wasn't good enough for her. And she said, quote, the only way Negro people can tear down the network of New Deal dishonesty, prejudice, crookedness, mistreatment of Negro soldiers, and empty gestures to the Negro race is to out the New Deal administration. She started to focus more on politics. And in 1944, she was a Second Ward Republican precinct captain. So what she did was organize efforts for people to go door to door advocating for the election of Republicans. And she said, I intend, through the Crusader organization, to expose the New Deal's pretended friendliness to the Negro race. So you can see how she is bringing more of her politics into the work that she had already been doing as trying to bring more Black people into aviation, and her calling out this falsity, which still happens today, of pandering, but not actually instituting well thought out and actually things that productively and significantly changed conditions for Black people. So things that looked really shiny on the outside that by Willa's estimation wasn't good enough. Now, there's, of course, a longer and deeper argument amongst Black people about whether integration or continuing segregation, segregated units was, well, lots of different layers to it. Whether segregated units was good enough, whether integration was, as a whole, better for Black people in terms of what Black people would have gotten out of it. Lots of other layers of arguments and debates along those lines. But in terms of Willa, she was not interested in segregated units. So Willa also said that the Republican Party was, quote, the party of the people, the party of redemption, the party of law and order, and the party of justice and equality. So Willa was definitely thinking from a partisan way this time, thinking of, okay, this is a party that's, these are the ideological lines that I want to be aligned with. So the war ended in 1945, and by the end of the war, the Coffee School had trained more than 1,500 Black students, including some that went to the 99th Pursuit Squadron, which was an all-Black unit that went to North Africa. But Cornelius and Willa, they were against the segregated units and they wanted integrated ones. And Willa said there is not segregation in the CAA programs, and there have been no race riots or violence because of this fact. So she was saying, look at these examples of situations in which there was integration and there weren't just segregated units and everything's going just fine. Like the fear that you might have of there being race riots or something, some extreme hostility because of integration isn't actually one that's based on anything legitimate, is what she was saying. The Coffee School closed once the war ended. The government contracts were done. And Willa became involved even more heavily in politics. In 1946, she became the first Black woman to run for a congressional seat in Chicago's 1st District. She ran as a Republican and lost in the primary election. And Willa and Cornelius divorced in 1947. And she ran for Congress in 1948, in 1950 as well, but she lost. And I guess that kind of got out. She was like, okay, the people have spoken. It's what it seemed like. She tapped out of politics. And in 1955, in her third marriage, she married Reverend J.H. Chappell, or Chappelle, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, who was a minister of the West Side Community Church in Chicago. And she was active in the church. She later describes herself during this time as being a church woman. And in 1962, she started teaching in schools again. She taught typing, shorthand, and secretarial classes. So back to the beginning, kind of like a full circle, because she was teaching typing and writing and secretarial classes earlier too. But in 1971, she retired from teaching. And the Federal Aviation Administration appointed her to its Women's Advisory Board. 3 years later, she resigned from the board, and her husband died in 1984. And Willa herself died on July 18th, 1992 from complications of a stroke. At the time of her death, she was 86 years old, and she was buried in Lincoln Cemetery in Chicago. So posthumously, she was recognized. 2003, she was inducted into the Aviation Museum of Kentucky's Hall of Fame. In 2016, she was inducted into the Illinois Aviation Hall of Fame. And in 2022, she was inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame in Dayton, Ohio. So her legacy has been acknowledged in those very visible ways. And that's her story in a nutshell.
It's quite the story to wrangle. This is like, she just did so much, and she was such an advocate for other people, and she was involved in teaching in a lot of ways. And this kind of makes me regret, like when I was in college, you just want to get stuff done. I should have talked to my teachers more. Who knows what they did? Like, this is wild.
That's true. Yeah.
If I was just like taking like a penmanship class, which is important, and I never thought about the teacher, but you ask her about her life, and she's like, well, ran for office. I was a pilot. I did like all of these different things. It's just quite the story she has.
Yeah. And I think I read that when she was appointed to the Women's Advisory Board, she was listed as a school teacher, which she would have been most recently, but they didn't mention anything about her aviation history. And I'm not sure if that's because they were like, oh, she's in the Women's Advisory Board of the FAA. Like they know she had something to do with aviation. But I also wonder if she was like, well, this is what I'm doing. This is what I've been doing most recently. This is who I am now. And it's not like that's any less than all of the aviation that I did. And clearly I'm here on the board for a reason. I'm just curious as to if that was something that was self-chosen or if that was a slight maybe, or if it wasn't a slight and that was just somebody else who communicated it that way. But it is interesting to think about the reasons behind that.
Yeah, especially because it was such a big part of her life for so long. Yeah, I love that Bessie Coleman showed up here as well, because we've done an episode on her, right? My brain is not we've done so much stuff.
I know.
Half the time I'm like convinced I've never talked about something and I find out I did an episode on it, and the other half it turns out we haven't done an episode. Yeah. So I was like, I think we've done Bessie Coleman. We've definitely talked about pilots before.
Yes, we have.
Right. I'm pretty sure we talked about it.
We did.
Because like she's one of those that when you don't have actual teachings and you come from a very white background, you might not have known about her until college or after the fact when you had to do your own research. Like definitely one of those conversations.
Yeah, definitely. And so if anybody wants to go and listen to more about Bessie Coleman, then y'all can go back and listen. So by my estimation, by my list, it was the 15th episode that we did of Female First. I went back and looked because I'm like, did we? Because we've done a lot of episodes.
Like, we definitely talked about it. I just don't know where. When.
So that would have been years ago. Mm-hmm. Probably
before the pandemic.
Years ago.
Yeah.
2 or 3 years ago, maybe.
Was it before me? Is that what you said, Anney?
No, I thought it would have been before the pandemic.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we did it in person, didn't we?
The 50th we did in office.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, that makes me feel better.
You're remembering correctly.
I was convinced because I remember how she died. And we had that conversation in that episode about flights and would you fly a plane if you ever wanted to pilot? Yeah.
I remember that conversation.
Yes.
Good, Anney.
Yes, but I'm so glad, as always, you brought this story to us because I had not heard everything about Willa Brown and what she had done. And so it is such a great story. And I hope more people hear it. And we always appreciate you giving us all these details and doing all of that work. So
no problem. I'm happy to share these stories, truly.
Yes. Well, we are always happy to have you. Where can the good listeners find you?
So y'all can find me online. Y'all can just go to my website, which is yvesjeffcoat.com. Yves is spelled Yves. My last name is Jeff, Jeff, Coat, COAT, just like the thing you wear.com. So you can go there and you can get to a lot of other places from there. You can join my newsletter. If you go to my contact page, you'll find a contact box. If you scroll down, you'll get to the newsletter. You can also just go to Instagram and you can find me there at Not Apologizing. And if you're a social media person, then that will be basically the only way you can find me directly on social media. And you can also find me on the podcast On Theme, which is a podcast about Black storytelling. And you can also go to listen to all the other episodes of Female First that we've done here on Stuff Mom Never Told You.
Yes, the many episodes we have done. And Yves makes great content, as hopefully you all know if you listen to this. So go check Yves out in all of the places. And listeners, if you would like to contact us, you can. You can email us at stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff I Never Told You. We have a T-Book store and a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks as always to our super producer Christina, our executive producer Maya, and our contributor Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your favorite shows.